This video is all about mixing vocals to sit properly in the mix. You're about to learn 5 specific techniques for making your vocals sit better. Get the vocals right and your mixes will soon start to sound more professional. But first, be sure to grab the free vocal mixing cheat sheet. There is a link in the bio or on screen now. There are numerous techniques to make the vocals sit properly in the mix, to make them the focus of the track without making them sound odd or separate from the rest of the mix. And the 5 things that you'll learn to do in this video are volume automation, serial compression, I've got a quick volume balancing trick for setting the right volume, an EQ technique called range allocation, and then we'll cover reverb and delay too. So let's dive right in with vocal automation. So let's start by having a listen to this track. The vocal hasn't had any dynamic processing yet. I've got some tonal EQ there to shape it and a bit of de-essing, but dynamically it's just the original performance. So that's how it sounds with no automation and no compression. Now what I'm going to do is just automate this quickly using the Waves Vocal Rider plugin. So we could start by reducing this S here. I struggled to set the de-esser on this vocalist. They sing it kind of oddly, so we can just play with this automation and bring that down a bit. Animals all around. Where do they come from? I also think this whole phrase here could actually be a little bit louder to give it a bit more energy. Animals all around. Where do they come from? Here. So there we go, just using any form of volume automation, whether you use Vocal Rider or whether you do this manually. And what I would do on this kind of vocal, if it's not a pop track, then I would probably do individual words. So I'd go through and I'd manually turn down this word or turn up quieter words. Or you can go a level deeper and do it more like this, where you're doing a constant automation. You could record that in using a physical fader. It doesn't matter how you do it, but I find that some form of volume automation is absolutely essential if I want the vocal to sit right in the mix. So the next technique is serial compression. And normal compression is when you use one compressor. Serial compression, multiple, think serial killer. We're using multiple compressors. It's really that simple. So you can start to play with different attack times and release times on each compressor, but what I'm going to do here is just keep it nice and simple. I'm actually going to use the Waves RVox because I love how that sounds on these kind of tracks. And we're doing it on the bus so that the automation is going into the compressor rather than after it. And I'm just going to dial in a few dB of gain reduction with this one and then just do the same with the second plugin. Animals all around. Where do they come from? Animals all around. Animals. So now I'm just checking the gain to make sure it's the same volume when I've got that bypass as engaged. Animal, animals, animal, animals, animals all around. Cool, and then we can just duplicate it. You can try using a fast compressor first and then a slow compressor second. So the first one trims the peaks and then the second one is more constant. But for the sake of demonstration, and I find myself doing this a lot anyway, I'm just going to duplicate it. Animals all around. Where do they come from? Animals all around. So this is with no compression. Animals all around. Where do they come from? And this is with compression. Animals all around. Where do they come from? So now we've got quite a lot of compression going on, but because we've split across 2 compressors, it sounds more natural, more musical, and we're still focusing on the dynamics here, because if we want the vocal to sit right in the mix, it needs to be quite consistent. So it's always in that perfect place, on top of the mix, but not poking out too much and not suddenly getting too quiet. So now that we've addressed the dynamics with some automation and some compression, the next step is to set the level. And this is actually much harder than you would think. Now, I've already balanced the volume here quite a lot, but after applying automation and compression, the overall volume is going going to be different. So what we need to do is just adjust this fader again until we're happy with it. Now, the trick I want to share with you now is to use the volume knob on your headphones or on your monitors as a tool to help you set the level of the vocal. Now, this is going to be really hard for me to demonstrate here, but I'm going to do it on the master fader instead. So if you're doing this at home, just use the monitor control on your output or the headphone level. But for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to use the master fader. And what we want to do is make sure that at a low volume, the vocal is the main thing we can hear, because that's normally the case. The vocal is the focal point, especially in pop and mainstream. Something like this, maybe not so important, but I still want the vocal to be at the forefront. And if we can hear the vocal more than anything else at a low level, that means it's loud enough. And then when we turn the fader back up, louder than you would normally listen, what you should find is that the vocal instead starts to fit in with the track a bit more. And when it's really loud, we can hear the bass, the kick, the snare, the guitars, everything just as much as the vocal. And generally that's a good sweet spot for the level of the vocal. So let's try that. So we're going to make the volume really low, and I'm going to adjust this fader on the bus until the vocal is by far the most prominent thing. So yeah, it passes that test. It was way louder than everything else. And now when we bring it up to a normal volume, and in fact, what I recommend you do here is turn up your monitors louder than you would normally monitor at. And we want to make sure the vocal doesn't pop out too much and it sits kind of in line with everything else. And if anything starts to get drowned out by everything else. Animals all around. Where do they come from? So I actually think it could come down a touch, and this is going to depend on the genre. With this track, I want it to have a bit more of a kind of consistent level between the different parts. I don't want the vocal to be super loud like we would have in a mainstream pop track. So I'm just going to bring it down a touch. Animals all around. Let's check it at low volume again. It's still the most prominent feature. So there we go, a great trick for setting the level. And now technique number 4 is to use what I call range allocation to create a pocket for the vocal in the mix. So if I go into the vocal processing that I've already done with EQ using the new Wave Sheps Omni-Channel, which is an amazing plugin if you just want a kind of Swiss Army knife of plugins, this is great. And what you'll see is on my EQ, which is this one here, I've got some gain in the upper mid range at about 3.6K. I'm then cutting a bit at 240, which is opening up that top end even more and removing some of that body so that the vocal comes out through the mix a little bit. And then I'm not boosting the top end because I actually decided to use a vintage Aural exciter here, which is adding that top end instead. But the thing we want to pay attention to is this upper mid boost here. That's close to 3.7K. Now, range allocation is simply the act of allocating a range of the frequency spectrum to an important part. So, for example, here, because I boosted at 3.7K by quite a bit, 2.4 is quite aggressive, the vocal obviously has a lot of energy now in that area and around that frequency. So I'm going to avoid boosting that frequency on the guitars. I'm going to avoid boosting it on the snare or anything else for that matter. I've allocated this range to the vocal mentally, or even you can write this down on a notepad while you're mixing. So what I'm going to do now to create some space for that is cut that same frequency that I've allocated to the vocal in other instruments that are competing. If you want to learn more about this technique, you can check out my video on range allocation. But what I'm going to do here is just have a listen, and you can do this with me. Listen out for any parts in the mix. It's probably going to be the guitar or the snare that are competing with the vocal, and we can try cutting that frequency in those to create more of a pocket in the mix for the vocal. Animals all around. So that guitar is really getting in the way more than anything. I think that's the main thing. So let's load up an EQ, and we're just going to go to 3.7K around there. And I'm actually going to make this a bit narrower so we can be a bit more aggressive with this. And I'm going to start dipping it until the guitar starts to sound odd. At that point, we know we've gone too far, and then bring it back up until it feels like it's getting out of the way of the vocal a bit. Animals all around. Where do they come from? Hills digging down. I can hear their sounds. Where do they come from? I'm freaking out. It actually sounds fine with quite an aggressive cut there. I like what it's doing to the guitar tonally as well. I'm just going to adjust the bandwidth now because it feels like we're losing some of the aggression around 2K and some of the sweetness around here, around 8K, so that we're getting the vocal more space in the mix, but we're not removing too much of that nice stuff in the guitar. Animals all around. So you can hear when I make this really wide, the guitar starts to sound a bit too warm, whereas when I make this narrow, we've still got a lot of that aggression around 2K. So let's find the sweet spot in the context of the mix.
Animals all around. Where do they come from? Hills digging down. I can hear their sounds. Where do they...
So that creates a bit more space for the vocal in the mix. I'm going to play this again. Focus on how the vocal suddenly sounds like it has its own little pocket when I bring this in, and it sounds clearer. It's easier to focus on the lead vocal.
Animals all around. Where do they come from? Hills digging down. I can hear their sound.
So we could repeat this process on other competing instruments. We could do it on the drum bus, and I might try that, just a really subtle cut on the drum bus to make a bit more room there as well.
Animals all around. Where do they come from? Hills digging down. I can hear their...
That sounds great too. So you can experiment with that on different channels. I tend to do it on group buses, so normally all the guitars will be getting in the way and it's quicker just to do it on the group bus here. Sometimes you'll want to do it on individual channels, but that's a great technique. And then finally, technique number 5 is to create a space around the vocal using reverb and delay that makes the vocal sit in the mix but doesn't make it stand out too much, because we want to find this balance. If we use too much reverb and too much delay, the vocal is going to sound like it's really far away. It's not going to be the focal forefront of the mix. Whereas if we don't use enough reverb and delay, the vocal might sound a bit unnatural and dry, and it's not going to sound congruent and consistent with the rest of the mix. It's going to sound too separate. So let's start with reverb, and then we're going to move on to delay after that. So again, I'm going to do this on the bus instead of the channel itself, because that's where all of our processing is. I've already added a plate reverb with an EQ just in case I need it, but I'm not actually doing anything there. And then we've got the plate itself. So the reason I'm using a plate reverb is that it has a shorter decay time than, say, a room reverb or even a hall or a chamber or anything like that. And that works really well on vocals, because if we have a generic room reverb on the rest of the track that's maybe 1, 2, 3 second decay time, then we have a slightly shorter reverb on the lead vocal, and that could be a plate with 1 second like you see here. It could just be another room that's 1 second. Well, having that shorter decay time is going to make the vocal stand out a bit more, sound like it's a bit closer to the listener. So it doesn't really matter what type of reverb you use. Here I'm using a plate, but we could solo this, and I could use something like, if I just load up the new Logic reverb, which is also great. There's no right answer. I can just scroll through some of these and see what sounds good in the context of this mix and use that. There isn't really a rule where you use a plate in this situation and use a room in this situation and use a chamber in this situation. Just scroll through them, see what sounds good in the context of the track. So let's make it really loud and let's see how some of these sound.
Animals all around. Where do they come from? Hills digging down. Animals all around.
So that sounds pretty cool. Let's compare that to the plate that I already had going.
Animals all around. Where do they come from? Hills digging down.
So that's a bit more subtle. In the context of the mix, it's nowhere near as noticeable, but I like that. It's adding some space to the vocal, but it's not noticeable. It's not making it sound like it's further away. So just play around with whatever reverb you have, see what works in the context of the track. And then if we want, we can also add some shaping to this. So if we want to make the vocal sound brighter, let's say that it was recorded with a more affordable microphone. Affordable microphones tend to lack as much high end. So if you find yourself boosting the high end quite a lot when you're shaping the tone of the vocal, we'll try boosting the high end on the reverb as well, because that will have the effect of changing the tone of the vocal. The tone of the reverb will influence the tone of the vocal. If we have a dark, warm reverb, it's going to make the vocal sound darker and warmer. If we have a bright, airy reverb, it's going to make the vocal sound airier and brighter. So we can start to play around with that too.
Animals all around. Where do they come from? Hills digging down.
You can hear how much that influences the tone of the vocal. Now, tonally, I'm quite happy with the way the vocal sounds, and I like how this plate sounds as it is. So today I'm going to leave it, but just something to bear in mind. And then the next step is to set the level. So I'm going to bring this up until I can distinctly hear the reverb, and then I'm going to back it off a touch, because for me, that's often the sweet spot.
Animals all around. Where did they come from? Hills digging down.
So about there, and now we can just mute this a few times just to check that it's adding some space and making the vocals sit better in the mix, sound a bit more natural and congruent with the rest of the mix, but equally it's not pushing the vocal too far away.
Animals all around. Animals all around.
So now without that reverb, it sounds a bit dry and unnatural. Bring it back in.
Animals all around.
Sits a little bit better. And I haven't actually gone through and added reverb to the other instruments yet. Once I do that, it's going to sound even more cohesive. And the next step then is delay. So I'm going to load up a new bus for this. And the trick that I want to show you in particular now is what I call a stereo delay. And technically the full term would be stereo slapback delay. So we're just going to use stereo delay. And to get a stereo spread, we're going to use a different time on the left and right. Now I find, depending on the tempo of the track, anywhere between 80 to 200 milliseconds works well here. And we just want to have a different time on the left and right to give the vocal a bit of a stereo spread. And we're going to get rid of the feedback, so we want it to be a slapback, and we want to make sure it's set to 100% wet.
Animals all around. Where did they come from? Hills digging down.
Okay, so it sounds weird. It sounds like the vocalist is in like an arena or something all of a sudden. So let's tweak the time of those delays in the context of the mix.
Animals all around. Where did they come from? Hills digging down. I can hear their sound.
So I think in this context, it sounds better with a faster delay, and 90 on the right, well, 90-ish, 110-ish on the left gives us that stereo spread. And again, we just want to bring this up now until we notice it and then back it off.
Animals all around. Where did they come from? Hills digging down. I can hear their sounds.
And now with that, the whole space around it is starting to become a bit too much. So I'm going to back off the reverb a bit and balance that with this delay.
Animals all around. Where did they come from? Hills digging down.
So let's listen without either of those.
Animals all around.
Dynamically and tonally, the vocals sitting well in the mix, but it sounds a bit dry and unnatural. But when we bring those in,
Animals all around. Where did they come from? Hills digging down. I can hear their sounds.
so we don't want it to be too overpowering, just enough to create that sense of space and make the vocal sit better in the mix. So there you go, 5 techniques to make the vocal sit right in the mix. Give each of those a try. In most mixes, I find myself using all 5, so feel free to do the same, but make sure you have an intention and give these a try. But if it doesn't work with your track, then that's fine. You don't have to do all 5. So now the next problem is, well, there's so much more to vocal mixing. I could talk about EQ a lot more, compression, and when we're talking about reverb and delay, we haven't really covered mono delay and the different applications of reverb when it comes to vocals in particular. There's just so much that goes into getting a professional, clean vocal sound that always sits well in the mix. So I put together a free vocal mixing cheat sheet that will walk you through loads more tricks and tips and techniques in addition to what you've learned here. And you can download that, use it when you're mixing to make sure you get the vocals right every single time. It's completely free. There's a link in the bio, or there's a link on the screen now. Just go to that page, enter your details to get that free PDF. And then I want to hear from you. Do you use automation and compression on vocals when you mix? Or do you find yourself using one or the other? Leave a comment below saying both, or compression, or automation, and maybe tell us why you prefer one of those over the other. Because I think that plays a really big role in how the vocals sit in the mix. So that's all from me. I'll see you next week, and remember, create regardless.